Good morning. I'm George Willey. Welcome to The Other Side. On this show, we ask our guests to walk with us to the other side and consider positions different from their own. Are we driven by reason or are we driven by passion? Let's find out. Today we are privileged to have Bill White. Just the name will suffice as an introduction. However, for newcomers to Texas and a few Martians who could have snuck in, let me tell you that Bill White served this city and the nation with distinction. He served as mayor of Houston from 2004 to 2010, holds the record of winning his second term with nearly 91% of the votes. You have to go back 60 years to find another mayor who was that popular. He served as Deputy Secretary for Energy under the Clinton administration and has led several energy companies in Houston and won the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award for his leadership when he shamed Katrina with his compassion and hands-on management of those who came in from New Orleans. A Harvard scholar, a top brass lawyer, an avid cyclist, and most importantly, the husband of novelist Andrea White.
There you go.
Bill, welcome.
It's great to be with you.
Bill, so last year you published a book which made some headlines, critically acclaimed book titled America's Fiscal Constitution, Its Triumph and Collapse. Timely book. Tell us about that book and what's the core thesis of it?
The core thesis is that nations must live within their means, and that for the longest time our country had a bipartisan consensus that we would only borrow for extraordinary purposes. During the depths of a depression, during war would be the notable examples.
Right. And I think you quoted about 4 instances in which we borrowed.
Yes, we also borrowed to prevent states from leaving the nation, which was a long time ago.
Okay.
And a couple of times to link the nations or to acquire new properties to expand the nation. Mm-hmm. The Panama Canal linked the nation, the railroads that linked the East and West Coast.
Did you borrow for the Louisiana Purchase?
We borrowed for Louisiana Purchase. So, you know, those were the cases in which we borrowed. And for other routine programs, such as sustaining military defense during peacetime when we weren't at war, or a major war, and for domestic programs, then we relied on taxes to pay for our government. And in that way, we created more generation opportunities for the next generation. Most people have come here from different parts of the world in order to create a better life for their kids and grandkids. And part of that was we didn't leave them with a big debt on their hands.
Now, not only did you say that we borrowed earlier, but the borrowing was a little different from what we did after 2001.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, it's my story, which is not widely appreciated, is that this tradition of borrowing only for extraordinary circumstances occurred for almost 200 years. The founding fathers of the countries discussed the principles that were followed by future generations. But something changed. And it wasn't a big shift in American public opinion, but it began in the Bush administration when we borrowed to expand Medicare. We borrowed while cutting taxes to fund a war. In prior wars, every single war in the past, we had raised taxes so that the civilian population would help reduce the debt and also share some of the sacrifices of the military officers.
So the 4 previous times when we did borrow for an extraordinary set of circumstances, did we pay the debt back?
Yeah, we paid the debt down in all cases except the debt after World War II. Mm-hmm. After World War II, then there was the Cold War, this East-West confrontation with the Soviet Union. And during that period of time, the debt increased for, you know, a quarter century after the end of World War II, increased somewhat, although very slowly. Mm-hmm. On an inflation-adjusted basis, the debt actually went down. Slowly, but at a very accelerated pace after 2001, we began to increase the debt.
The borrowing that we did previously, prior to 2001, in your book you say that that debt was not, the creditors were not foreign nations.
Right.
Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yes, there was another extraordinary thing about what happened after 2001. The United States, rightly or wrongly, had always been concerned about its financial independence, and that meant that it wasn't going to be dependent on foreign creditors who could use the fact that they held our debt in order to change or alter or influence our foreign policy. After 2001, then we borrowed immense amounts, including to our biggest creditor, which is the People's Republic of China and its central bank. In the past, we would have been concerned about how that might hamper our national, independence. And there was even a case that I cite in the book when, towards the end of the Bush administration, the Russians, during the financial crisis, were urging the Chinese in order to sell some of our government-backed bonds in order to force Congress to assume liability for some of those. So we've already had at least one instance in which people are aware of the fact that foreign creditors now have unprecedented influence over the United States.
So they have, there are weapons other than nuclear weapons out there that they could use against us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, is it realistic that these countries can actually use that debt against us?
It's not.
Or have they?
Not in in normal times. It would be in the interest, let's say, of the major creditors, which are in East Asia, China, Japan, as well as some of the European sovereigns, as well as some of the funds in the Middle East and otherwise. They want a healthy U.S. economy. They don't want to send the U.S. in recession, et cetera. But there is something very, strange about, the forward deployment of Marines in Australia and the, maintenance of fleets in the South China Sea in order to make sure that China observed international rules and norms. We devote all this military power. But if there was an all-out conflict, then they would have a weapon that they could use against the United States.
Now, we are, about $19 trillion now in debt. Is it possible for us to pay this now, or are we going to continue with this? And just to add to that, Krugman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, he seems to think that a debt is a good thing.
Yeah.
So I'm sure a lot of folks are confused about this. What's the real thing here?
Well, I agreed with Mr. Krugman a number of his points that he's made through the years, including his criticism of the use of debt while cutting taxes while we were at war. However, if I go back to his earlier writings, he likened the use of, he said, monetary policy, if there's an economic illness, is like an aspirin.
Yes.
And to incur debt, fiscal policy is like to narcotics. You might have to use narcotics. Some people you had morphine when they've had serious injuries. Yes. Sometimes that's necessary, but you've got to be very apprehensive about it. Here is the litmus test. Here's the thing, when we talk about 19 billion or 10 or trillion, yes, or 10 trillion, these are big numbers. Yes. But here's the fundamental reality. Each year that goes by, particularly as interest rates return to normal, which is the Federal Reserve's objective, particularly that, then the amount of money we pay in federal income taxes, the percentage of those funds that go to interest on debt increases. So we get less current benefits, yes, from the taxes we pay because we were paying for old bills. And that's a basic principle of public finance. And I'll tell you that arises from the fact, one way to think about debt is that every year since 2001, the United States has borrowed more money than it's paid in interest on the debt. And that's like a family who borrows money every year to pay the interest on the mortgage and credit cards.
Right.
After a while, more and more of their income is consumed by interest payments, and so you really have to compare the amount of interest you have to pay with what your obligations. If your debt is small, you can pay more and more interest a year per year within your income. But when debt starts to absorb 40 or 50% of the federal income tax receipts, then the country's worse off.
But Bill, is the scale important here? I mean, you know, the family budget and a national budget, are they qualitatively the same?
No. I mean, there's the difference in this sense that a country has the ability to expand credit, has monetary policy. It could devalue its currency. It could cause inflation, which reduces the value of debts. And also, many economists, and I understand why, want to make sure that we have learned the lesson of the Great Depression, where people were, as I chronicle in the book, sort of reluctant to incur debt in order to maintain some level of economic.
And the older generation, you know, they still tend to do that. Yeah.
However, let me point out that we're borrowing massive amounts, and we are not in recession, and have not been in recession for a long time. And moreover, we have large known expenses which are going to be rising faster than the growth of the economy, notably our Medicare expenses. Therefore, if interest consumes more and more of each tax dollar, and this is where it is like a family, that the more debt you incur, then the more of your income will have to be dedicated to what we call debt service, paying interest on the debt. And the less value you can get from your tax dollars to pay for everything else.
In that case, then let's project about 30 years from now. If we continue this way, what would be the scenario? I mean, it's going to be dire situation here.
Yeah, you know, I'm not one of these people who, you know, throws up their hands and thinks, you know, the world is coming to an end and everybody ought to buy gold. I think that the United States will honor its debt. It won't restructure its debt. It won't be in the same condition of Greece, et cetera. And the whole world has an interest in our being able to pay that debt. Moreover, if we defaulted on the debt, it would cause sort of a collapse of the world's financial system, and we'd go down with it. However, what it will mean is that we will have less money to invest in things like federally funded research and development. We will have less money for new programs to strengthen the social safety net. And there is a big question in many people's minds whether we will be able to afford this international security umbrella that the United States has provided for much of the world ever since the end of World War II.
Democrats created the Great Society. Social Security, Medicare, welfare, student loans, perhaps. These were all under Democratic administrations. And of course, you know, the great President Johnson was instrumental in a lot of this. Much of our debt is now, you know, stirred by these expenses. So how do Democrats then tell the Republicans, hey, you know, you need to get this under control? And they're saying, hey, you know, lower taxes, less government, small government. Now that debate is hot. Everybody's talking about that. Everybody's screaming about that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well,
as a well-respected Democrat?
Well, I'll tell you, you know, as you mentioned earlier, I served in the Clinton administration, and as I chronicle in the book, one of the election mandates coming out of 1992 was that we needed to try to bring our revenues and spending in balance.
And you did.
So there were some tax increases, and there was spending discipline. So people, this was one of the problems that confronted the Clinton initiative to expand health care, is when the budget office came back and they said that we couldn't do it without borrowing, then many people who are mainstream Democrats as well as Republicans said we can't afford this new program. And you mentioned President Johnson. What people don't, you know, what I am knowledgeable about politics and public policy, but I did not realize until I got into the, you know, transcripts of the tapes and the memoirs and going through
visiting his library in Austin is just really instructive about some of the things that he did.
Yeah. It was the conception of Medicare and Medicaid that we would not borrow to pay for those programs. Now, were the projections of the costs off? Yes. Were there efforts, particularly with Medicaid, to cut it back in order to avoid extra expenses? Yes. But most Americans, I think, would understand that it is not wise to borrow to pay for Medicare when the big bills of the baby boom generation retirement are yet to come due. And very few Americans do understand that ever since we did balance a budget in 2000, and a couple of years before as well, we have been borrowing to pay for the growth of Medicare. I don't think that makes any sense. If Medicare is worthwhile, then we ought to have a tax that is dedicated to pay for it. We do have some taxes, but they're not enough to cover the cost. But we ought to have some form of taxation where you say, you know, this tax is covering. And if Medicare is too expensive, then, and we need to figure out ways to contain that cost, then there's nothing better than to let the American people know exactly what the cost is through taxation and find the right balance.
Now, we have not had any significant rise in income taxes in a while in this country. On the other hand, our expenses have been going up on all sides. So it kind of looks a little silly that we haven't raised our taxes. But if we were to raise taxes, what kind of percentage would you say that we will need to kind of deal with this in a reasonable fashion?
Well, the first thing I'll just say, I am critical of some of the fiscal policies, as you know from reading the book, of both the Obama administration and the Bush administration, who I point out had, in a sense, a much more lax view about debt than did the preceding administrations. You know, in both those administrations, even in the administrations that borrowed, the president was always acutely aware of the need to pare down the debt and spoke about the problems with debt very frequently. Not as much in the last two administrations. However, I just wanted to say there were tax increases. Now they have they did occur on the, you know, 0.6% or the top 1%, you could say, of the population. But they have produced new revenues, and yes, and they have cut the deficit from what it would otherwise be. So I'll just make that point, that there was, you know, some attempt to do that. And moreover, there are many Republicans in Congress who may not have expressed support for that, but they knew that it needed to be done, and they were just afraid to be labeled as, you know, pro-tax. But yes, they know if they want the military budget that the Republicans want to, that we shouldn't borrow to pay for the military every year. Now, the path forward to me is, I'm not real keen on saying that Bill White, or for that matter, any president, should just impose her or his will on the country. But I do think that we need to return to the principle that we ought to pay for the amount of government that we want, and if we're not willing to pay for the government program or service, we shouldn't offer it. And I think a good place to start is what we referred to as Medicare.
I mean, imposition of the will, most certainly we don't want, but we most certainly look for leadership.
Yeah, I think
all of these matters.
I think my counsel to both the Democratic and Republican leaders is to articulate that to make sure that the American public understands that since 2001 we have been borrowing to pay for Medicare. We borrowed to pay, we borrowed ever since to pay for the expansion to include prescription drugs.
And the war.
And the war, yeah, and the war as well.
Yes.
But
which you talk about in your book.
As the war is winding down, and we have these baby boom generations bills coming due, then there ought to either be taxation dedicated to support the Medicare program, and that is identified as in support of Medicare, which could require new taxation, or we ought to have some limits on what can be reimbursed. And we ought to have that public discussion and public debate. And I believe that a majority of people in Congress and our elected representatives, before and after elections, will come up with that right balance in the next several years. But if we don't have that conversation, then
we are not having that conversation.
Then we're going to have a very a difficult problem. I think most Americans, once they understand how Medicare has been funded in the last decade or so, they will be first surprised and dismayed. And secondly, I think most would prefer to retain a pretty broad base of security for our seniors. Many of the Democrats have a difficulty addressing this issue because there will be somebody in the audience from either party saying, if we're borrowing to pay for Medicare and we weren't paying for Medicare to begin with, how could we afford the Affordable Care Act?
Yes.
And there's not a good answer to that.
The military spending, the sacred cow. Clearly, we're spending a lot of money on our military. Right. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, one thought is a contemporary thought, which is, since we've been borrowing to pay for routine military expenses, separate and apart from the war, as I show in the book and have graphs, up through, during the Bush administration, we're borrowing about as much to expand the non-war related expenses at the Pentagon and the Pentagon expansion as we were in the war itself. Then I find it a little surprising to watch a couple of these debates where almost all the Republican candidates were for cutting taxes and expanding the military at the same time.
At the same time.
I mean, expanding military expenditures. Now, I'm an old-fashioned internationalist who does believe that having a global security umbrella with a diverse and great nation like the United States is a great contribution to the world and to our own security. However, it comes with a cost. And my parents' generation, after World War II, was willing, for a quarter century after World War II, they were willing to bear that cost in a form of taxation, much higher taxation than we have today.
Well, they were both teachers, so they taught you well, Bill. The other issue is, how do we pay the the debt, and I had thought, you know, with the oil prices this low, to tack on a 50-cent tax on gasoline at this point, I don't think people are going to be averse to that. They're going to fight you on that. I mean, unless for ideological reasons people don't want to do this. I think this is a great opportunity for us to get in there. What do you think about that? I think during the Clinton administration, we added a 5-cent
yeah,
tax.
and the president at the time would have supported a higher tax. That's what he could get through Congress. And the gasoline tax was raised in the Reagan administration as well.
Yes.
Just here in late 2015, Americans are seeing something play out, which is unusual on this gasoline tax. And the story goes like this. At the beginning of the 1950s, we had an interstate highway system, which has bipartisan support. Thank goodness we have. I mean, we can complain about I-10 and 610, but without that program, we wouldn't have had them. And it was supported. The principle of the program was it would be supported by motor fuels taxation and taxes on tires and a few other things that would go into a trust fund. And the amount of transportation improvements funded by the federal government would come out of that trust fund. During the severe economic downturn of 2008, whatever you may, in the name of stimulus, and I think it was justified at the time, we decided to increase infrastructure spending, including highways and roads, and that was done with debt. But we haven't weaned ourselves of that. Now that the that unemployment has gone down and growth has returned to levels which may be unsatisfactory, but are on level with norms. So Congress, before the end of this year, will make a decision of whether to fund our federal transportation programs within the revenues provided for the trust fund, or whether to borrow additional money for doing so. And there are members of Congress on both parties who would support, more Democrats and Republicans, who would support having additional level of tax dedicated to that fund rather than borrowing to pay for those.
Bill, we run out of time, so thank you so much for coming. It was indeed a privilege to have you. We've been talking to Bill White. That suffices. We'll see you next time on The Other Side.